What if I told you the real end of William Wallace wasn't the clean, tragic fall of a hero, but something so methodically cruel that even hardened medieval executioners shifted uncomfortably? The William Wallace most people know, the one painted by storytellers and immortalized in films, a towering figure of courage, defiance, and Scottish pride. But the Wallace who met his fate in August 1305, didn't he die with a swift blow on the battlefield or in some noble final stand? His death was orchestrated as a slow, public unmaking, a cold-blooded performance meant to terrify an entire nation into obedience. By the summer of 1305, Scotland was exhausted. Years of rebellion had drained the land, famine and war had worn down even the proudest clans. Edward I of England, known as Longshanks for his towering frame and ruthless reach, was determined not just to defeat Scotland militarily, but to crush its will to resist. Wallace had been a thorn in his side for nearly a decade, a commander who rallied ragged bands of men into an army, who humiliated English forces at Stirling Bridge, and whose defiance had made Edward bleed both gold and pride. To capture Wallace wasn't just a victory, it was a chance to make an example so horrifying that no Scot would dare rise again. And yet, the capture didn't come in a blaze of swords and shields. It came quietly, treacherously. For months Wallace had been on the run, moving through the glens and hills, taking refuge in loyal households when he could. Many of his comrades had already been killed or had bent the knee to Edward, their loyalty bought with pardons and land. The rebellion's network of trust was fraying. That was when Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish knight and former ally, slipped into the pages of infamy. Menteith, acting under orders from the English crown, arranged a meeting that promised safety, perhaps even a chance to regroup. We may never know exactly what words were exchanged or what doubts flickered across Wallace's mind that night, but when the moment came, there was no warning, no raised sword, no final rallying cry. Wallace was seized quietly, surrounded before he could react, bound like a common criminal. To the English, this was the perfect irony. A man who had been the loudest voice for Scottish freedom taken in total silence. Betrayal in the medieval world wasn't just a tactical blow, it was a spiritual wound. It undermined the sacred bonds of loyalty that tied warriors to each other. In the eyes of many Scots, Menteith's act wasn't just the capture of a man, but a tear in the fabric of honor itself. Edward couldn't have scripted a better opening act for the spectacle he intended to stage. When Wallace was chained, it wasn't the chain of a prisoner of war, someone to be exchanged, ransomed, or perhaps pardoned for political convenience. No, these were the chains of a trophy. His capture wasn't going to be a quiet matter handled behind closed doors. Edward intended to parade this victory, to make Wallace's humiliation an event in itself. And so from the moment the iron closed around his wrists, William Wallace's final days became a script written by his enemies, each scene designed to strip away not just his life, but his image, his dignity, and his very place in Scotland's story. Picture that moment, the damp August mist rolling across the Scottish countryside, the clank of fresh-forged shackles, and Wallace's eyes hard, cold, and defiant meeting those of his captors. The rebellion might be dying, but in that gaze was the stubborn ember Edward feared most. It would take days, weeks even, to extinguish that ember, and Edward I intended to make sure every man, woman, and child along the road would watch it fade. In the story of William Wallace, there is no moment more chilling than the betrayal that delivered him into English hands. History records the name Sir John de Menteith, but not the full measure of what passed between him and the man he betrayed. Menteith was a Scottish knight, a man of rank and some repute, entrusted at times with the defense of castles and the keeping of the king's peace. But in the fractured political landscape of 1305, allegiances shifted like sand in the tide. The war had left many nobles torn between national loyalty and personal survival, and Edward I knew how to exploit such weakness. Menteith's loyalty to Wallace had once been unquestioned. Perhaps they had fought together in skirmishes, perhaps shared the meager warmth of a campfire after a winter raid. But whatever trust had been there was now gone. Some chroniclers claim Menteith acted out of self-preservation, others that Edward offered land and favor in exchange for Wallace's capture. In a time when the gallows awaited anyone accused of rebellion, the temptation or fear may have been overwhelming. The betrayal itself was not dramatic. There was no clash of arms, no heroic last stand. According to accounts, Menteith lured Wallace into a meeting under the guise of friendship or safe passage. In the stillness of night, men moved in English soldiers or Menteith's own retinue and seized the Scottish leader before a weapon could be drawn. No blood spilled, no shouts to rouse the glens. Just the sound of chains snapping shut and the heavy breath of men who knew the weight of what they had done. In medieval Scotland, betrayal was more than a personal act, it was a curse. To turn on one's ally, especially in a struggle as desperate as Scotland's, carried a stain that no confession could cleanse. The Gaelic bards and lowland poets would later sing of Wallace's courage, but Menteith's name would survive only in whispers, as a warning of how low ambition or fear could drag a man. From that moment on, Wallace's fate was no longer in his own hands. Bound in iron, he was placed under heavy guard, the English determined not to risk a rescue. The orders were explicit: he was to be delivered to London alive. Edward wanted more than a corpse, he wanted a breathing, suffering symbol of Scotland's defeat. The English knew exactly what they were doing. In the medieval world, the manner of a leader's capture could shape the morale of his people as much as the outcome of a battle. A dramatic death in combat could inspire resistance for generations, but a silent, ignominious arrest sent a different message: that resistance was not only futile, but foolish. By denying Wallace even the dignity of a final fight, Edward had already begun his psychological war. That first night, Wallace's world narrowed to the bite of metal against skin, the smell of damp earth, and the knowledge that his own countrymen had delivered him to the enemy. The long journey south lay ahead, weeks of deliberate humiliation, staged not just for those who would see it, but for those who would hear of it in the markets and hearthside gatherings of England and Scotland alike. It is in that quiet, treacherous moment the trap was sprung, that the tragedy truly began. And as the English prepared to move him through the heart of their realm, the cruelty was only just beginning to take shape. At dawn, the first stage of Edward's theatre began. William Wallace, Scotland's most defiant son, was wrenched from the shadows and placed in chains meant not only to hold him, but to brand him as defeated. Thick iron cuffs bit into his wrists and ankles, joined by a heavy collar that would drag against his throat with every step. Some accounts suggest he was confined in a wooden cage for parts of the journey, a crude lattice of timber that allowed the crowds to gawk at him like an animal. The point was not security alone, it was humiliation. This was no discreet transfer of a dangerous prisoner. The English made sure every town, every hamlet, every market along the route was forewarned. Heralds went ahead, spreading the word that the infamous Wallace would pass through. Farmers abandoned their plows, merchants closed their stalls, and children clambered onto barrels and hay carts for a glimpse. When he appeared, chained and under guard, the jeers and shouts followed him like a shadow. Medieval England understood the power of spectacle. Prisoner parades were a form of propaganda, designed to strip away the myth and leave only the man broken, dirty, mortal. The journey from Scotland to London was over 300 miles, a punishing trek even for a free man. For Wallace, it was an ordeal of exposure to the weather, to hunger, to the cruelty of strangers. Some days he walked, stumbling under the weight of the shackles. Other days he was tied to a horse and dragged along, unable to shield himself from stones, mud, and whatever filth the crowd hurled at him. The summer air could turn cold and wet in an instant, soaking his thin clothing until it clung to him like a shroud. At night, he likely slept in makeshift pens or guarded corners of inns, always chained, never unwatched. The English took particular satisfaction in parading him through places that had suffered from Scottish raids. In those towns, the people spat at him, cursed him, and hurled scraps of refuse. Children, encouraged by their elders, ran alongside to taunt him. In others, the reception was quieter but no less cutting stares heavy with hatred, or worse, with fear. Fear that even seeing him might be taken as sympathy for his cause. And yet, witnesses remarked on something unnerving. Wallace did not beg. He did not curse his captors or return the insults. His silence was not submission, it was defiance, and it unsettled those who expected to see a man already crushed. A face hollowed by hunger still carried the hard lines of pride. That was dangerous. Edward wanted him humiliated, not heroic. Imagine the contrast, the roar of the crowd, the slap of chains, the stink of unwashed bodies pressing in, and in the center of it all a man walking with the same grim resolve he had carried into battle. It was a scene meant to weaken the will of Scotland, but for some, especially any Scots who might have been in those crowds, it may have done the opposite. By the time London's grey towers rose on the horizon, Wallace's body was gaunt, his skin rubbed raw where iron met flesh, his hair matted from rain and dust. But he was still breathing, still standing. That alone made him dangerous in the eyes of his enemies. And so, Edward's next move was to bury him not in earth, but in silence. The gates of London swallowed him whole. Beyond the drawbridge and the yawning portcullis, Wallace entered a place designed as much for intimidation as for defense, the Tower of London. In the medieval mind, the tower was more than stone walls and battlements, it was a statement. For centuries, it had stood as the embodiment of royal power, a fortress that doubled as prison, palace, and executioner's antechamber. Once inside, men rarely walked out free. The English had no intention of treating Wallace as a knight or a prisoner of war. There would be no courtesies, no chance to plead for ransom, no negotiation for honorable terms. He was placed in one of the tower's colder, more forbidding chambers, likely a narrow cell with damp stone walls that bled moisture into the air. Rats scurried in the dark, fat on scraps and waste. The stench of mildew and human confinement clung to everything. Here, isolation was the point. Edward I understood the danger of giving Wallace an audience. Even in chains, the man's presence could ignite rebellion, his words could inspire hope. So, no priest was sent to hear his confession. No family was permitted to visit. He was cut off entirely, left to sit with the gnawing cold and the knowledge that his fate had already been decided. The tower's architecture itself worked against him. The thick walls muffled sound, turning the world beyond into a dull, unreachable murmur. Light came in slivers through narrow arrow loops, never enough to warm the air. The floor was uneven stone, slick with damp, and sleep came only in short, broken intervals, interrupted by the rattle of his own chains. For many prisoners, such conditions broke the will long before the executioner's hands ever touched them. But Wallace remained unbent. Chroniclers note that he refused to sign any confession or acknowledgement of Edward's authority. This act of defiance was not trivial, it was a final stand in the only way still available to him. He would not legitimize the king who sought to destroy his country. Picture the scene, the dim flicker of torchlight pulling against the cell wall, casting long, shifting shadows. The muffled toll of bells from somewhere outside. The distant, indifferent murmur of guards speaking in a language of the enemy. And there, in the gloom, Wallace sat upright, eyes fixed not on the walls around him, but on some point far beyond them. For Edward, this stubbornness was intolerable. If Wallace could not be broken in private, then he would be destroyed in public, with every moment of it etched into memory. Silence had denied Edward the confession he wanted, but it would not deny him his spectacle. The king would turn the trial into theater, and the execution into something darker still, a lesson carved into flesh for all to see. On the morning of August 23, 1305, William Wallace was hauled from the Tower and taken to Westminster Hall. If the Tower had been Edward's instrument of silence, Westminster would be his stage. The hall was one of the largest and most imposing spaces in England, a vaulted chamber of stone and timber, where the weight of authority pressed down like a physical force. Sunlight filtered through high, narrow windows, casting pale stripes across the floor, and every sound, every footstep, every cough echoed into the rafters. This was not a trial in any modern sense. There would be no impartial jury, no deliberation, no hope of acquittal. The verdict had been set before Wallace ever stepped into the room. But Edward wanted a performance, not a quiet sentence. Nobles, officials, and carefully selected members of the public were in attendance, their murmurs dying to silence as the prisoner was brought in. Guards flanked him, their armor clinking, their eyes fixed forward. The charges were read aloud with deliberate venom: treason against the English crown, murder, rebellion, and the devastation of English lands. The words were meant to drip with outrage, as if the king himself were the aggrieved party in some moral drama. But Wallace, gaunt from imprisonment, yet still holding himself with a soldier's posture, refused to play the part of the repentant criminal. When accused of treason, he did not deny the bloodshed, but stood firm on one crucial point. In a voice that carried across the hall, he declared, "I could not be a traitor, for I was never his subject." The words struck the chamber like a thrown gauntlet. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some scoffed, others shifted uneasily. In that moment, Wallace cut through the legal theater and laid bare the truth as he saw it. His fight had not been against his own king, but against a foreign oppressor. That defiance was dangerous. It carried the risk of turning him, even in chains, into a martyr in the eyes of anyone who still dared to dream of Scottish freedom. And so the court moved swiftly. The sentence was announced with chilling precision. He would be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Each step of the punishment was spelled out: first to be hanged by the neck, but cut down before death, then disemboweled and emasculated, then beheaded, and finally, his body cut into 4 parts to be displayed across the realm. This was not mere execution, it was ritualized obliteration, each act a symbolic erasure. Hanging for treason, disembowelment for sacrilege, quartering for rebellion. The sentence itself was designed to be a form of propaganda, a living warning before death. A corpse turned into a message afterward. The air in Westminster Hall thickened. Even those loyal to Edward knew the fate described was monstrous, but no one spoke in opposition. The flicker of torchlight on the polished stone walls seemed to make the space colder, the shadows deeper. Wallace stood silent now, perhaps knowing words had done all they could. What lay ahead was not a fight he could win, but it was one he could face without surrender. And in Edward's mind, that was reason enough to make the next act even more brutal. The trial was over. The performance of destruction was about to begin. The words of the court had barely finished echoing through Westminster Hall when the reality of the sentence began to settle over those in attendance. Hanging, drawing, and quartering, it was the most feared punishment in England, a sentence reserved for those deemed not merely enemies, but existential threats to the crown. It was as much a public ritual as it was a method of killing, its stages carefully choreographed to inflict maximum pain, humiliation, and symbolic destruction. Its origins lay deep in the legal traditions of the realm, codified under Edward I's reign as a response to treason, the ultimate crime against the king's person. To medieval society, treason was not just political betrayal. It was a moral and spiritual offense, an affront to God's ordained order. And so, the punishment had to reflect that gravity. The condemned would suffer not only in body, but in legacy. The hanging was to humiliate, marking the traitor as stripped of all honor. The disembowelment was for sacrilege, symbolizing the tearing out of a heart that had dared to rise against its rightful ruler. Castration was both a physical agony and a symbolic erasure of lineage, ensuring the traitor's bloodline could not continue. The beheading removed the thinking, plotting head from the body, and quartering scattered the pieces so that no grave could become a place of pilgrimage. Edward's council knew that this was no ordinary rebel. Wallace had not been some isolated bandit leader, but a figure capable of uniting clans, igniting a national cause, and humiliating the English crown on the battlefield. That kind of figure could not be allowed to die quietly. His end had to be a lesson engraved into the memory of every subject, Scottish or English, who might one day think of defying royal authority. Even the choice of locations for each stage was deliberate. The dragging to the site of execution would display his degradation to the common people. Smithfield, the chosen place of death, was a bustling public market square, an open space where thousands could watch. The display of his body parts in far-flung towns would spread the king's warning across the land. When the sentence was read aloud, Wallace stood without protest. His refusal to beg was its own form of defiance, but it was also a calculated risk. In that moment, he must have known that silence could transform him from a defeated rebel into a martyr. The English recognized this too, but they gambled that the sheer horror of his death would overwhelm any romantic retelling. In the medieval mind, executions were more than punishments, they were morality plays. The condemned served as the villain in a drama whose final act was meant to reaffirm the king's justice and God's will. But for that to succeed, the audience had to leave not with pity, but with fear, and so Edward's men would ensure that the next morning's events would be remembered not for Wallace's courage, but for the scale of his suffering. What they could not foresee was that suffering, in certain stories, becomes the sharpest kind of legend. The morning of August 23, 1305, began not with a march, but with a dragging. Wallace was not permitted to walk to his execution, for walking was a dignity reserved for knights and nobles. Instead, he was bound tightly to a wooden hurdle accrued, flat plank then fastened by rope and chained to a horse. The horse's hooves clattered on the cobblestones, pulling the hurdle forward in jerks and jolts. Wallace's body scraped against the rough wood and the filth of London streets, the movement jarring every wound and bruise he had gathered over weeks of captivity. The dragging was more than transport, it was ritual humiliation. In English law, traitors were denied the honor of walking to the scaffold, denied the mount of a horse, denied the stillness of a dignified end. They were to be treated as less than human, paraded like slaughter-bound beasts. London had been ready for this moment. Word of Wallace's execution had spread like wildfire. The streets along the route to Smithfield Market were crowded with thousands of men, women, and children packed shoulder to shoulder, some leaning from upper windows to get a better view. Smithfield was no quiet gallows field. It was the city's beating heart, a place where livestock was traded, where festivals were held, and where executions were staged for maximum visibility. Some in the crowd shouted curses and threw refuse rotten vegetables, scraps of bone, handfuls of mud. Others merely watched, their faces taut with something harder to read: curiosity, awe, perhaps even discomfort. There were always those who came to executions not for justice, but for spectacle, drawn by the morbid theater of it. The smell was thick sweat, smoke from cook fires, the stench of unwashed bodies. Over it all hung the sharp tang of blood, for the dragging had already opened gashes along Wallace's skin. Flies circled, settling on wounds when the hurdle slowed. Witnesses later claimed that Wallace scanned the crowd as he passed, his eyes calm, unflinching. Some said he prayed silently, others swore he locked his gaze on the sky, as if already beyond the reach of his captors. Whatever the truth, one fact was clear: he did not beg. And that absence of desperation unsettled more than one onlooker. By the time the horse pulled the hurdle into Smithfield, the noise of the crowd swelled into a restless roar. The market had been transformed into a stage. Within scaffolds rows where traders normally sold livestock. Soldiers held the perimeter, not to protect Wallace from the mob, but to ensure no hand English or Scottish could deliver him a quicker death. The dragging had been long, cruel, and deliberate. It was meant to strip away his strength before the real torment began. Yet as the executioners stepped forward, their tools glinting in the sun, they found a man still breathing, still conscious, and most dangerous of all, still himself. What followed at Smithfield was not a swift killing, it was a dismantling. The first act was the hanging. Wallace was hauled upright, the rope looped around his neck, and hoisted until his feet dangled. The crowd hushed as his body strained against the noose. In most executions, this would have been the end. But for traitors, death was not allowed to come so mercifully. Before the rope could finish its work, the executioners cut him down. He collapsed, choking and gasping, but still alive. From there, The ritual grew darker. Wallace was stripped naked, his skin exposed to the glaring August sun and to the eyes of thousands. His hands and feet were bound wide apart, forcing him into a spread-eagle position upon a low wooden platform. It was as much a display as it was a restraint, his vulnerability laid bare before the crowd. Then began the disembowelment. With slow, practiced cuts, the executioners opened his abdomen. Accounts agree that Wallace remained conscious through much of this, his eyes flickering, his breath ragged. The executioners reached in, drawing out lengths of intestine and burning them before his face. The heat, the smoke, and the stench mixed with the iron tang of his own blood. This was not merely cruelty, it was symbolism. To burn the innards of a traitor before his eyes was to show that his very core, his courage and will, were being destroyed. Next came castration. To medieval audiences, this was not only an act of physical agony but a deliberate statement that Wallace's legacy, his power to create heirs, and by extension, his ability to father rebellion, ended here. It was a mutilation designed to carry a message: your fire dies with you. Even in an age accustomed to brutality, some in the crowd could not watch. Priests turned their heads, mothers pulled their children close, soldiers stared down at their boots. But there were others, those who jeered, who spat, who leaned forward for a better view. Smithfield had become an amphitheater of human extremes, where pity and bloodlust battled in the hearts of the onlookers. Through it all, Wallace's reaction became part of the legend. Some said he whispered a prayer, lips barely moving. Others claimed he looked toward the sky, unflinching, as though his mind had gone far beyond the reach of the executioner's knives. Whether or not those accounts are true, one thing is certain: he did not give Edward the satisfaction of screams. By the time the executioners stepped back from their work, Wallace's body was pale and slick with blood. Yet the punishment was not over. The final stage, death, would not be an act of mercy, but the conclusion of a grim ritual that had been unfolding since dawn. At last came the moment when the executioners could end it. Wallace, barely clinging to life after the hanging, disembowelment, and castration, was positioned for the final blow. The axe was raised high, glinting in the sunlight above Smithfield Market. With a single, brutal stroke, his head was severed from his body. But death was not the end Edward I had in mind. The head was lifted for the crowd to see: a grim, lifeless mask that had once defied a king and then immediately prepared for display. It was dipped in boiling tar, the blackened coating preserving it against the rot, so that it could remain as a visible warning for months. Soon after, it would be mounted on a spike atop London Bridge, where traders, travelers, and commoners alike would pass under its gaze each day. The body was next. Executioners worked with methodical precision, cutting it into 4 parts: 2 arms, 2 legs, each severed cleanly at the joints. These were not trophies to be hidden, but messages to be sent. Edward ordered that each quarter be transported to a different place where rebellion still smoldered: Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, and Stirling. The towns chosen were no accident. They were strongholds of Scottish pride or resistance, places where the sight of a limb swinging from the gates could chill the bravest heart. To approach a city and see such a thing, blackened flesh, stiffened by the wind, bones peeking through where birds had fed, was to be reminded of the king's reach. Farmers on their way to market, merchants passing through, children trailing after parents, all would see it. And parents would whisper the story, sometimes with fear, sometimes with quiet defiance. This was Wallace. The practice of displaying executed traitors' remains was not unique to Wallace. In England, it was the final step in ensuring that the dead could not be buried as martyrs. No grave meant no shrine, no place where followers could gather, no physical focus for rebellion. But it also meant that death itself became public property, a body transformed into royal propaganda. Yet, in Scotland, the effect was not entirely what Edward intended. The horror of Wallace's fate, spread in pieces across the realm, became part of the oral tradition. The brutality did not erase him, it magnified him. Tales of his courage at the trial, of his refusal to bend the knee, and of the savage nature of his execution were told and retold, often with details sharpened in the telling. In trying to destroy him utterly, Edward had made Wallace's memory impossible to ignore. His body had been scattered to the winds, but his legend was already knitting itself back together in the minds of his countrymen. In the days that followed, London's bridge became both a warning and a monument. Wallace's tar-blackened head stared down at all who passed, merchants hauling their goods, fishermen returning from the Thames, foreign envoys entering the city. It was impossible to ignore. The eyes, clouded and lifeless, seemed to watch every soul who walked beneath. A silent message from the king. This is the price of defiance. Across England and Scotland, his limbs hung in their designated towns, swaying in the wind. In Newcastle, the arm pointed toward the north, as if accusing the land from which he came. In Berwick, the leg hung near the gates, a grotesque talisman against rebellion. Perth and Stirling bore their own pieces of the man, each one slowly blackening under sun and rain until they were little more than shriveled reminders of what awaited those who resisted. For Edward I, this scattering was meant to stamp out the embers of resistance once and for all, and for a short time, it seemed to work. Fear tightened its grip over the Highlands. Chieftains thought twice before raising their banners. Markets and taverns buzzed with talk of Wallace's fate, always in hushed voices, always with glances over the shoulder. But fear has a strange way of curdling into something else. In Scotland, the story began to shift. The gruesome details that Edward intended as deterrents became the markers of martyrdom. Mothers told their children not just of Wallace's death, but of his refusal to submit. Ballads wove themselves into the oral tradition, casting him as the unbroken spirit of a free Scotland. His silence at the trial, his steady gaze during the parade of humiliation, his endurance under torture, all became proof that a man could be killed without being conquered. Only 9 years later, Robert the Bruce would ride into history at the Battle of Bannockburn, defeating the English and securing Scotland's independence, at least for a time. The victory did not erase Wallace's execution, it gave it a new meaning. His scattered remains had been a warning from Edward. Now, they were remembered as seeds sown in blood, each fragment of his body a part of the land that would not yield. The irony could not have been sharper. Edward had sought to erase Wallace from memory by tearing him apart. Instead, he had transformed him into a symbol that no blade could cut down. The lesson lingers through the centuries. Regimes can kill a man, but they cannot kill the idea he dies for. Picture it one last time for towns, each with a rotting limb swaying in the wind. London Bridge crowned with a blackened head. And in the shadows of Scottish hearths, a whispered name, passed from generation to generation: Wallace. Not a corpse, but a cause, not a warning, but a rallying cry.